the manicured silence of Marietta. The lawns are perfect, the SUVs are polished, and the secrets are buried deep. But when a grandfather realizes his adopted granddaughter has been left behind like an unwanted piece of luggage, the suburban dream turns into a courtroom nightmare. If you believe that family is about who stays, not just who shares blood, please stay with me. The most painful betrayals often happen behind the most beautiful doors, and I wouldn't want you to miss how this one ends. The silence of Decatur, Georgia, was usually a heavy, comforting blanket for Stephen Collins. At 63, he had earned his quiet. 31 years as a family law attorney had left him with a sharp mind, a tired back, and a cynical reflex for late-night phone calls. In his world, a ringing phone at 2 a.m. was never a celebration. It was a flare gun fired from a sinking ship. When his phone lit up the nightstand, the name Skyla stopped his heart for exactly one beat. Not Anthony, his son, not Natalie, the wife who curated their lives with the precision of a museum gala. It was his 8-year-old granddaughter. Skyla, baby, what's wrong? Stephen's voice was instantly lawyer steady, even as his hands shook. The sound that came through the line wasn't crying. It was the ragged, hollow breathing of a child who had been crying so long she had run out of tears. "Grandpa," she whispered. The word carried the weight of 1,000 miles. They left. Stephen sat up, reaching for his glasses. "Who left, sweetheart? Where are you?" "Daddy and Mama and Alex. They went on the big boat, the cruise." Her voice cracked. "They said I had school Monday. They said I'd be bored, but Alex doesn't have school either. Why did they take him and not me?" A cold, familiar stone settled in Stephen's chest. He had seen this math before, the cruel arithmetic where one child is an investment and the other is an expense. "Are you alone in the house, Skyla? Mrs. Patterson from next door said she'd check on me tomorrow. I have the iPad. But Grandpa, it's dark, and the house is making noises." Stephen was already out of bed, his mind calculating 6 hours by car, 45 minutes by plane. "I'm coming, Skyla. I'm right here. Stay on the phone with me until you hear the garage door." He moved through his dark house with practiced efficiency. He called his neighbor, Joseph, a retired mechanic who didn't ask questions at 2:15 a.m. because he knew that in Stephen's life, emergency was a literal term. By 3 a.m., Stephen was at Hartsfield Jackson, his briefcase heavy with a digital recorder he hadn't used in years. The flight to the suburban outskirts of Atlanta was a blur of fluorescent lights and bitter coffee. By the time he pulled the rental car onto Whitmore Drive in Marietta, the sun was beginning to touch the tops of the perfectly manicured Georgia pines. The Hall residence looked like a postcard: beige siding, a 2-car garage, and flower beds that Natalie maintained with the intensity of someone whose self-worth was tied to HOA approval. Skyla was waiting at the window. She was in her pink pajamas, the ones with the cartoon sloths, and her curly dark hair was a wild nest of neglected tangles. When she saw Stephen's car, the front door flew open. She didn't say a word. She just ran. Stephen caught her at the bottom of the porch steps, the impact of her small body against his chest, knocking the air out of him. She gripped his neck with a strength born of pure terror. He felt her exhale against his shoulder, a long, shuddering breath, like a car engine finally turning over. "I got you," Stephen whispered, his eyes stinging. "Grandpa's got you." As he carried her inside, Stephen's eyes didn't miss a thing. It was a habit he couldn't turn off. He walked past the hallway gallery wall, a curated collection of the Hall family's happiest moments. He stopped, still holding Skyla. There were 11 photos. Alex at hockey, Anthony and Natalie at the Grand Canyon, Alex's finger painting framed in gold. He counted. Out of 11 photos, Skyla was in exactly 2. In one, she was slightly off-center. In the other, a Christmas shot, she stood at the far left edge, just half a step behind everyone else, wearing a blue sweater while the other 3 wore matching red. "I look like I'm just visiting, don't I?" Skyla said quietly, following his gaze. Stephen felt the lawyer in him, the man who had cross-examined judges and broken seasoned liars, rise to the surface. He reached into his breast pocket and felt the cold plastic of the digital recorder. "No, sweetheart," Stephen said, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous register. "You look like the evidence." The interior of the Hall residence was a masterclass in suburban staging. It smelled of expensive vanilla candles and the lemon-scented floor wax that Natalie insisted upon. To any casual observer, it was the sanctuary of a successful American family. But as Stephen walked through the kitchen, still holding Skyla's small, trembling hand, he saw the house for what it truly was, a crime scene of the spirit. "Are you hungry, sweetheart?" Stephen asked, forcing a softness into his voice that felt at odds with the tension in his jaw. Skyla nodded tentatively. "I have my frozen nuggets, but Mama said I have to be careful not to make a mess in the kitchen while they're gone. She said the house has to be showing ready in case they decide to list it next month." Stephen opened the stainless steel refrigerator. It was stocked for a family of 3, not 4. There were organic protein shakes for Anthony, pre-cut fruit platters that Alex liked, and a bottle of expensive champagne presumably waiting for a celebratory return from the cruise. On the bottom shelf, pushed into the dark corner, sat a single half-empty box of generic chicken nuggets. He set to work making her breakfast, but his eyes were constantly scanning. In 31 years of family law, Stephen had learned that people lie with their mouths, but they tell the truth with their surroundings. He spotted a calendar pinned to the side of the fridge. It was color-coded. Blue for Anthony's firm events, green for Natalie's Pilates and charity auctions, and bright red for Alex's life. Alex, hockey tournament. Alex, $20,000 cruise departure. Alex, orthodontist. The red ink dominated the grid like a bloodstain. He searched for Skyla's name. He found it once, in small black pencil at the very bottom of a Tuesday. Skyla, dentist, reschedule. There was no mention of her school play. No mention of the March birthday she had celebrated just weeks ago with a lonely store-bought cake, while the big birthday budget was reserved for Alex's upcoming trip to Great Wolf Lodge. "Grandpa?" Skyla's voice pulled him back. She was sitting at the kitchen island, her feet dangling several inches above the floor. "Why are you looking at the calendar like that?" "Just checking the dates, baby," Stephen lied. "I want to make sure I don't miss anything important." After the eggs, which Skyla ate with a frantic sort of hunger that suggested her last meal had been a long time ago, Stephen suggested she go get dressed. As soon as she disappeared down the hall, Stephen pulled the digital recorder from his pocket. "Thursday, 8:42 a.m., he whispered, his voice a low vibration in the empty kitchen. Observation of the family residence. The refrigerator is stocked for 3. The household calendar shows a 90% focus on the biological child, Alex. Subject Skyla is mentioned only once in a tentative capacity. Evidence of systemic marginalization is mounting. He walked toward the laundry room. On the counter sat 3 high-end, brand-new suitcases. They were the ones Anthony and Natalie had used to pack for the cruise. Beside them was a small, tattered backpack belonging to Skyla. It was slumped on the floor, empty, as if it had been discarded in the middle of a sentence. Stephen took out his phone and snapped a photo. Exhibit C, the discarded child. He then moved toward the gallery wall he had seen earlier. He stood in front of the Christmas photo again. Natalie, Anthony, and Alex were a sea of coordinated crimson. Skyla stood at the edge, the blue sweater she wore making her look like a stranger who had accidentally wandered into the frame. He remembered what Skyla had said. Natalie forgot to order my sweater. A woman like Natalie Hall didn't forget. She was the president of the local garden club. She organized 1,000-seat charity galas. She was a woman of meticulous detail. The forgotten sweater was a message. It was a silent declaration that Skyla didn't belong in the color palette of their lives. "I'm ready," Skyla called out. She had changed into a faded t-shirt and leggings. She looked small, fragile, and far too old for her 8 years. "Let's go then," Stephen said, tucking his recorder away. "We're going to downtown Marietta. I think a chocolate milkshake is in order." As they walked to the car, Stephen looked back at the house. To the neighbors, it was a dream. To him, it was a ledger of unpaid emotional debts. Anthony thought this was complicated. He thought Skyla was being dramatic. By the time Stephen was finished, Anthony would learn that in a court of law, drama is irrelevant, but a documented pattern is absolute. The blue Chevy Malibu rental car felt like a sterile bubble of sanity as Stephen drove toward Canton Street. Beside him, Skyla was quiet, her small fingers tracing the edges of her tablet, a device that had served as her only guardian for the last 24 hours. The silence was broken by the sharp, rhythmic pulse of Stephen's phone vibrating in the cup holder. The caller ID read Anthony. Stephen didn't pick up. He wanted it on record. He wanted the digital footprint of a man calling from the middle of the Caribbean while his daughter sat in a rental car in Marietta. 10 minutes later, as they pulled into a parking spot near the town square, the notification pinged. A voicemail. Stephen waited until Skyla was distracted by a passing dog before he stepped a few feet away and pressed his phone to his ear. "Dad, come on, call me back." Anthony's voice came through, breezy and layered with the distant sound of steel drums and crashing waves. "I got your text. Look, I know it looks bad, but you're making this into a whole thing. Natalie and I talked about it for weeks. Skyla's been struggling with her grades, and we thought the cruise would be too much stimulation. It was a parenting decision, Dad. A tough one. Plus, the neighbor was right there. It's not like we left her in the woods." Stephen felt a vein pulse in his temple. He had heard this tone thousands of times in his career. The reasonable voice of a man who had convinced himself that his selfishness was actually a form of discipline. "And hey," Anthony continued, his voice dropping an octave as if sharing a secret. "She gets dramatic, Dad. You know how she is since the adoption went through. She seeks attention. By you flying down there, you're just reinforcing that behavior. We'll be back Sunday. Just keep her fed and maybe take her to a movie. This actually works out great for everyone. Catch you later." The line went dead. Stephen stood frozen on the sidewalk, the warm Georgia air suddenly feeling frigid, reinforcing the behavior. To Anthony, a child's cry for help at 2 a.m. wasn't a sign of distress. It was a tactical maneuver for attention. He pulled out his digital recorder and clicked it on. Thursday, 12:15 p.m. Received voicemail from Anthony Hall. Will note the terminology. Stimulation, parenting decision, dramatic. Subject refuses to acknowledge the legal definition of abandonment, instead pivoting to a narrative of child behavioral issues. No inquiry was made regarding the child's physical or emotional well-being during the 4-minute message. "Grandpa? Are you okay?" Skyla was standing by the car door, her brow furrowed. Stephen tucked the phone into his pocket and forced a smile. It was the courtroom face, the one that looked like granite even when the world was collapsing. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just work. Are you ready for that milkshake?" As they walked toward Rosie's diner, Stephen watched Skyla. She walked with her shoulders hunched, taking up as little space as possible on the sidewalk. She was a child who had been taught that her presence was a burden, a stimulation that needed to be managed rather than a life that needed to be cherished. Anthony had called it the Magic Kingdom. But as Stephen opened the door to the diner, the bell chiming above them, he knew he was looking at a kingdom of glass. Anthony and Natalie had spent $20,000 to sail away from their responsibilities, leaving behind a trail of evidence that Stephen was now systematically collecting. Inside the diner, the air smelled of fried onions and old vinyl. It was a place that didn't care about HOA approvals or social media aesthetics. Stephen guided Skyla to a booth in the back, far away from the windows. He needed her to feel safe. He needed her to talk. Because while the house gave him the physical evidence, he needed the history. He needed the stories that weren't captured in the 11 photos on the hallway wall. "Order whatever you want, Skyla," Stephen said, sliding the laminated menu toward her. "The sky is the limit." Skyla looked at the prices, her eyes wide. "Mama says we have to be careful. She says Alex's hockey gear is a big investment for the family." "Today," Stephen said, his voice as steady as a closing argument. "The only investment that matters is you." Rosie's diner was a relic of a different era, a place where the coffee was strong and the truths were usually served without garnish. Stephen sat across from Skyla, watching her poke at a tall chocolate milkshake with a plastic straw. The neon light from a Budweiser sign flickered against her face, highlighting the dark circles under her eyes. She looked like a small, tired bird that had forgotten how to fly. "Tell me about the school play, Skyla," Stephen said softly. He kept his hands folded on the table, a conscious effort to look relaxed. "The one in December. I saw the program your teacher emailed me. You were the narrator." Skyla's face went through a complex series of micro-expressions. Pride, followed quickly by a dull, aching disappointment. "I had 7 lines, Grandpa. I memorized them in 2 days. I bet you were wonderful. Were your mom and dad there?" Skyla took a small sip of her shake, her eyes fixed on the rotating pie case. "Daddy came for the first 10 minutes, but then he had to leave because Alex had a private hockey coaching session across town. He said he'd watch the video later." "And Natalie?" "She stayed home to help Alex pack his gear. She said she'd already seen the rehearsals, and it was more important to make sure Alex didn't forget his lucky mouthguard for the tournament." Skyla shrugged, a gesture so casual it made Stephen's stomach turn. "It's okay. The teacher let me sit with her after I was done." Stephen nodded, his mental ledger marking down every word. This was the pattern of documentation in real time. It wasn't just about the big things like a $20,000 cruise. It was about the small, corrosive moments that ate away at a child's sense of worth. "What about your birthday, sweetheart? March was only a few weeks ago." Skyla finally looked up, her gaze searching Stephen's face for something, permission to be honest, or perhaps an excuse to keep lying for them. "We had cake," she said. "At home. Just the 4 of us. Daddy got me this tablet." She tapped the device on the table. "I heard them talking the night before. Mama said we should have a party at the park, but Daddy said they'd already spent so much on Alex's big birthday at Great Wolf Lodge. He said they couldn't do big birthdays every year because it was too expensive. The too expensive argument. It was a common refrain in families like this, where the budget was an elastic concept for the favored child and a rigid wall for the other. Stephen knew exactly what Alex's Great Wolf Lodge trip had cost. Anthony had bragged about the $4,000 weekend on social media. "Skyla," Stephen said, his voice dropping into a serious, steady tone. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be very brave, even if you think the answer might get someone in trouble." She went still, her straw halfway to her mouth. "Do you feel like you and Alex are treated the same in that house?" The silence that followed was long enough for the waitress, Donna, to refill Stephen's coffee and move on to the next booth. Skyla looked at her lap, her curls obscuring her face. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper, competing with the hum of the air conditioner. "Sometimes," she said. Then, with a sudden heartbreaking clarity, "But mostly, I'm the blue sweater, Grandpa." Stephen paused. "The blue sweater? Like in the Christmas photo?" She nodded. "Mama picked out red sweaters for everyone weeks before the mall trip. When the day came, she told me mine hadn't arrived in the mail. She told me to just wear my school sweater because blue is almost like red. When we got to the mall, the photographer tried to move me to the center. True, but Mama said I should stay on the end so I wouldn't clash with the theme." She looked at him then, her eyes swimming with a wisdom no 8-year-old should possess. "I'm the thing that doesn't fit the theme, Grandpa. That's why I'm here and they're on the boat. I don't match the vacation." Stephen reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. His fingers were warm. Hers were like ice. He felt the digital recorder in his pocket, a silent witness to a confession that would eventually shatter Anthony's world. He wasn't just angry anymore. He was focused. "You are not a sweater, Skyla," Stephen said, his eyes locking onto hers with the intensity of a man making a sacred vow. "And you are not an afterthought. You are the whole point. Do you understand me? You are the only thing in that house that matters." Skyla's chin wobbled, a single tear escaping and tracing a path through the faint dust of the diner. She didn't sob. She just nodded, a small, serious movement that confirmed she had heard him. Stephen pulled his legal pad from his briefcase and wrote 3 words, underlining them twice. Pattern, documentation, court. The cruise would be over in 3 days. By the time the SS celebration docked in Miami, Stephen wouldn't just be a grandfather. He would be an architect of a new reality. Friday morning in Marietta arrived with a deceptive suburban calm. While the rest of Whitmore Drive was waking up to the sound of leaf blowers and the ritual of the morning commute, Stephen Collins was seated at his son's mahogany dining table, which he had converted into a temporary war room. Skyla was in the living room, focused on a word search book Stephen had bought her. The quiet was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic tapping of Stephen's laptop keys. He wasn't browsing the news or checking emails. He was drafting a petition for de facto custodianship. Every word he typed felt like a brick in a wall he was building between Skyla and the people who viewed her as a clashing theme. He pulled from 31 years of legal muscle memory, citing Georgia statutes and precedent cases with the cold precision of a surgeon. Petitioner, Stephen Collins. Respondents, Anthony and Natalie Hall. He paused, his fingers hovering over the keys. There was a profound, hollow ache in his chest. No father wants to sue his own child. He remembered teaching Anthony how to tie his shoes, coaching his little league games, and the pride he felt when Anthony passed the bar. But as he looked at the hallway, At that gallery of 11 photos where Skyla was an afterthought, the father in him took a back seat to the officer of the court. He opened his digital recorder and began to transcribe the notes he had taken since he landed. "Petitioner's Exhibit D," he murmured into the mic. "A documented history of financial and emotional disparate treatment. The biological son, Alex, received a 4-day cruise valued at approximately $20,000, while the adopted daughter, Skyla, was left without a legal guardian or adequate provisions. This is not an isolated incident of poor judgment. It is a systemic failure of parental duty." He spent the afternoon at a local FedEx office, printing and binding the documents into 3 neat manila envelopes. The weight of them in his hand felt like a weapon. So he then drove to the Cobb County Superior Court. The building was a familiar fortress of marble and bureaucracy. He knew the clerks, and he knew the judges. He knew that by filing this now, on a Friday, he would have a temporary order in place before the SS celebration even cleared the Florida coastline. When he returned to the house, Skyla was sitting on the porch. She looked up as he approached, her eyes scanning his face with that old soul intensity she had developed. "Are you going to make me go back when they come home Sunday?" she asked. It wasn't a question asked in fear. It was asked with the weary resignation of someone who had already prepared for the worst answer. Stephen sat down beside her on the wooden steps. He didn't offer a hollow platitude. "I spent my whole career telling people what the law says, Skyla. But today, I'm telling you what I say. I am going to fight for you. Whatever happens, you are not going back to being an afterthought." "But Daddy will be mad," she whispered. "Let him be mad," Stephen replied, his voice as steady as the earth beneath them. "Anger is the refuge of people who know they're wrong. You aren't a burden, Skyla. You're the whole point." He reached out and took her hand. For the first time since he had arrived, she didn't pull back. She didn't flinch. She simply leaned her head against his shoulder, a small, fragile anchor in the middle of a gathering storm. That evening, Anthony called again. This time, Stephen answered. "Dad, finally," Anthony said, the sound of a poolside party thumping in the background. "Natalie wants to know if you can take Skyla to the mall tomorrow to get her some new shoes. We'll Venmo you. Now we want her to look sharp for the welcome home photos on Sunday." Stephen looked at the manila envelope sitting on the kitchen counter. "She doesn't need shoes for a photo, Anthony. She needs a father who stayed." "Don't start with the lecture, Dad," Anthony snapped, his voice sharpening. "We're on vacation. We'll talk Sunday." "Yes," Stephen said, his eyes fixed on the empty space in the hallway gallery where a 12th photo should have been. "We certainly will." Sunday at 4:17 p.m. The heat in Marietta was oppressive, the kind of thick, humid air that made every movement feel labored. Stephen sat in the armchair by the front window, his legal pad resting on his lap. Beside him, Skyla was unusually still, her eyes fixed on the word search book, though she hadn't circled a word in 20 minutes. The sound of a heavy SUV pulling into the driveway broke the silence. The doors thudded, expensive, solid thuds, and then came the voices. Anthony's boisterous laugh and Natalie's sharp, commanding tone as she directed Alex to help with the luggage. They sounded like people who had just conquered the world, or at least a significant portion of the Caribbean. The front door swung open. Anthony walked in first, his skin a painful shade of lobster red, wearing a vibrant tropical shirt and a pair of Mickey Mouse ears perched precariously on his head. Natalie followed, draped in linen, her sunglasses pushed up into her perfectly highlighted hair. "We're home," Natalie chirped, her eyes scanning the room for the showing-ready perfection she demanded. Skyla, honey, come see what we got you from the gift shop. Skyla didn't move. She didn't look up. That silence, more than anything Stephen could have said, hit Anthony like a physical blow. The laughter died in his throat. "Hey, baby girl," Anthony started, his voice losing its breezy vacation lilt. "You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." "She can hear you, Anthony," Stephen said, standing up slowly. The movement was deliberate, his height and the stillness of his posture commanding the room. Whether she chooses to respond to the people who left her alone in the dark for 4 days is entirely up to her. Natalie's face hardened, the mask of the charming suburban hostess slipping. "Stephen, please. We discussed this on the phone. We are tired, we've been traveling, and we don't need a lecture." "I'm not here to give you a lecture, Natalie," Stephen replied. He reached for the manila envelope on the side table. "Anthony, check the mailbox, or don't. It doesn't matter, because I have the service copy right here." Anthony frowned, taking the envelope. "What is this? A bill?" "It's a petition for de facto custodianship of Skyla Hall," Stephen said, his voice dropping into the resonant, terrifyingly calm tone he used when delivering a closing argument. "Filed Friday morning in Cobb County Superior Court. It includes a temporary restraining order regarding her residence. She stays with me, effective immediately." The silence that followed was deafening. Alex, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, hovered in the doorway before Natalie hissed at him to go to his room. "You're joking," Anthony said, his hands beginning to shake as he pulled the documents from the envelope. "You're suing your own son? For what? A vacation?" "People take vacations. Shoo, Dad." "People take their children on vacations, Anthony," Stephen countered. "Or they provide legal guardians. They don't leave an 8-year-old with a standby neighbor and a box of frozen nuggets while they spend $20,000 on a cruise for their real son." "How dare you?" Natalie stepped forward, her voice rising to a screech. "We adopted her. We gave her this house, those clothes, that life. You can't just walk in here and take her." "I'm not taking her, Natalie. The law is," Stephen said, his eyes locking onto hers. "I have 31 years of documentation expertise. I have the hallway gallery where she's cropped out of 9 of 11 photos. I have the school play records where neither of you showed up. I have the birthday budgets compared side by side. And I have the recording of Anthony calling her dramatic from a poolside bar while she was crying in my arms." Anthony sank into the sofa, the Mickey Mouse ears falling to the floor. He looked at the paperwork, his eyes darting across the legal jargon. Abandonment, preferential neglect, systemic exclusion. "Dad," Anthony whispered, the word hollow. "Why are you doing this?" "Because she asked me why at 2 a.m, Anthony," Stephen said, looking at Skyla, who finally looked up, her eyes wide and wet. "And you didn't have an answer, so I went and found one." The Cobb County Superior Court was a place of high ceilings and low tolerance for excuses. 14 days had passed since the confrontation in Marietta. In 14 days, in which the suburban silence of Whitmore Drive had been replaced by the frantic scurrying of lawyers and the cold reality of discovery. Stephen sat at the petitioner's table, his suit pressed, his hands steady. Beside him sat Skyla in a simple purple dress, her small hands folded in her lap like a silent prayer. Across the aisle, Anthony and Natalie looked like ghosts of their former selves. The sunburns from the cruise had faded into a sickly, sallow gray. Natalie had spent the last 2 weeks trying to mobilize her social circle, but in Marietta, news of a custody battle with a retired legal legend like Stephen Collins traveled faster than a scandal at the country club. "All rise," the bailiff intoned. Judge Patricia Wynne took the bench. She was a woman known for a gaze that could strip the varnish off a lie at 50 paces. She opened the file, her eyes scanning the Exhibit A through Exhibit Z that Stephen had meticulously prepared. "Mr. Collins," Judge Wynne began, her voice echoing in the marble chamber, "you are seeking de facto custody of your granddaughter, alleging a consistent pattern of emotional neglect and abandonment. This is a grave step to take against your own son." "I am aware, Your Honor," Stephen said, standing. He didn't look back at Anthony. "I spent 31 years in courts like this one. I know the sanctity of the parental bond, but I also know when that bond has been traded for convenience. My granddaughter was not just left behind for a cruise. She was being erased from her own home, one photo and one expensive birthday at a time." Anthony stood up then. He didn't have an attorney. He had told Natalie that no lawyer in Georgia would take a case against his father, and he was right. "Your Honor," Anthony's voice was thin, stripped of its usual bravado. "We love Skyla. We really do. The cruise, it was a mistake, a lapse in judgment. We thought she'd be better off at home than on a loud ship. We didn't think it would be this." "A mistake is forgetting to buy milk, Mr. Hall," Judge Wynne countered, her voice dropping into a dangerous register. "Leaving an 8-year-old child alone while you spend $20,000 on a luxury vacation for your biological son is a calculated choice. I have reviewed the photographic evidence submitted by the petitioner. I have seen the gallery wall. I have heard the recordings." The judge leaned forward, her eyes pinning Anthony to his seat. "I see a house where one child is a prince and the other is a ghost. I see a child who called her grandfather at 2 a.m. because she was a stranger in her own bedroom. In my 20 years on the bench, I have rarely seen a pattern of emotional exclusion so documented and so devastating." Natalie began to sob, a sharp, jagged sound that filled the courtroom. But it wasn't a sob of remorse. It was the sound of a woman watching her curated life shatter into 1,000 pieces of unfixable glass. "Mr. Hall," the judge continued, "do you have anything to say in your defense?" Anthony looked at Stephen. For a moment, the 30 years of their history passed between them. The Little League games, the law school graduation, the father-son talks. Then Anthony looked at Skyla. She wasn't looking at him with anger. She was looking at him with the same old soul weariness he had spent years trying to ignore. The road had finally run out. "No, Your Honor," Anthony whispered, his head bowing. I failed her. I don't know how it got like this. I don't want her to hurt anymore." The silence that followed was the heaviest of Stephen's life. It was the sound of a family tree splintering. "Based on the testimony and the undeniable evidence of a systemic pattern of neglect," Judge Wynne announced, her gavel hovering over the wooden block, "this court finds that it is in the best interest of the child to be removed from the residence of Anthony and Natalie Hall. De facto custody is hereby granted to Stephen Collins, effective immediately." The gavel struck. The sound was final, like a door locking or a heart stopping. Stephen didn't feel triumphant. He felt tired. He reached over and took Skyla's hand. Her small fingers squeezed his with a strength he didn't know she possessed. The battle was over. But as Stephen led her out of the courtroom, past the weeping Natalie and the broken Anthony, he knew the real work, the work of making her feel like more than a blue sweater, was only just beginning. The drive back to Marietta to collect Skyla's belongings felt different than the arrival. The blue Chevy Malibu moved through the suburban streets with a quiet, steady purpose. The golden Georgia afternoon light filtered through the trees, casting long shadows that no longer felt like hiding places, but like the closing of a long, painful chapter. When they arrived at the house on Whitmore Drive, the for sale sign was already being hammered into the pristine lawn. Natalie couldn't stay. To her, the house was no longer a trophy. It was a testament to a public failure she couldn't curate away. Stephen stayed in the car, giving Skyla a moment. He watched her through the windshield as she walked up the driveway. She didn't run. She walked with a measured, calm dignity that seemed to age her beyond her 8 years. She emerged 10 minutes later carrying only 2 things: her tattered backpack and the blue sweater from the Christmas photo. She climbed into the passenger seat and buckled her belt. She didn't look back at the beige siding or the perfectly maintained flower beds. "Is that all you wanted?" Stephen asked gently. "The rest was just stuff," she whispered. "The sweater is, so I remember why I'm leaving." As they drove toward the freeway that would take them back to Decatur, the silence was no longer heavy. It was a clean slate. Stephen kept one hand on the steering wheel and reached out the other, resting it on the center console. Skyla placed her small hand over his, her grip firm and certain. "Grandpa," she said, her voice small but clear against the hum of the tires on the asphalt. "Am I your first choice?" Stephen didn't hesitate. He didn't even blink. He kept his eyes on the road ahead, watching the horizon where the suburban sprawl gave way to the open sky. "You aren't my first choice, Skyla," he said, his voice thick with a conviction that 31 years of law couldn't produce. "You are my only choice. You always were. Everyone else just got in the way of me seeing that." "Even Daddy?" "Especially Daddy," Stephen replied. He forgot what a miracle looked like because he was too busy looking at his own reflection. "But I see you. I've always seen you." They reached his house in Decatur just as the sun was setting. It wasn't a showing-ready mansion. It was a lived-in home with mismatched furniture, a dog that barked too loudly, and a hallway that was completely empty of photographs. "We're going to need some pictures for that wall," Stephen said as he opened the front door. "But we're going to do it right. No themes, no matching colors, just us." Skyla walked into the house, her backpack slung over her shoulder. She stood in the center of the living room, looking around at the stacks of books and the comfortable, worn-in chairs. For the first time since the 2 a.m. phone call, she let out a breath that didn't shudder. That night, Stephen sat in his office. He took the silver digital recorder from his pocket and looked at it for a long time. He thought about the 11 photos in Marietta. He thought about the $20,000 cruise. He thought about the man he had raised who had lost his way in the pursuit of a perfect image. He pressed the delete button. The evidence was no longer needed. The case was closed. He walked down the hall to the guest room, now Skyla's room. He stood in the doorway and watched her sleep. She was curled under a weighted blanket, her breathing deep and rhythmic. She wasn't a ghost anymore. She wasn't an afterthought. He realized then that in saving her, he had saved himself from the cynical silence of his own retirement. He had one last trial to win. The trial of being the person she deserved. Stephen Collins, the man who had spent a lifetime untangling the knots of other people's betrayals, finally went to bed. And for the first time in years, the quiet of the house didn't feel like a burden. It felt like peace. The Magic Kingdom was thousands of miles away, full of plastic smiles and expensive illusions. But here, in a small house in Decatur, the only thing that mattered was finally home.